You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Hey, hope you're doing well. I am getting near the end of my busy season, and I just submitted a major contract obligation, so I'm feeling a little bit better, but of course there's always the downside drag after you finish a project, to be sure. So nevertheless, I'm getting this podcast out, and if you're wondering what we're all about, if you're new to the podcast, well, we cover all things technical related to vertebrate pest management. So this week we're going to be talking about woodchucks, but before I do that, just wanted to let you know of some of the resources that are available on our website. You can see some of the books here. Hope you check some of those out. If you're looking for a specific training for your organization or company, you can definitely reach me as well at, how would you reach me? Well, it's Wildlife Control Consultant at gmail.com, Wildlife Control Consultant at gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Nevertheless, there's items here that you can certainly use if you're looking probably for some self-study and learning on your own, and you can certainly grab a hold of those products to be sure. All right, well, let's talk about what we're going to mention this week. This week, I want to talk about woodchucks, and part of this came from an in-law, a relative, I guess, would be one way to phrase it, who was having an issue with woodchucks on their property and wanted to know how to deal with it. So I thought, well, why don't I just do a podcast on it as well? Gave the person some advice. The individual woodchuck was in their backyard and didn't want to use any poisons, and because they had a couple dogs, I believe, and then of course children, and they didn't want to use any traps for some of the same reason, and they wanted to know if there were other ways that they could have probably convinced the woodchuck to move on. So I thought I would just cover some of those. I can't say it's covering every particular option, but covering every particular option isn't always important because you want to think about things that are going to work nevertheless. So why don't we get started on here? We're dealing with non-lethal eviction of denning woodchucks. So what is a woodchuck? Well, a woodchuck, you may call them a groundhog in your neck of the woods. Some people call them whistle pigs. Rock chuck is a little bit of a different species, so the woodchuck is primarily on the eastern half of the United States, but some of the principles here will certainly work for other ground animals like a woodchuck, to be sure. So you can see some of the data here on this particular animal. They're kind of neat, and of course they are burrowers, and so a lot of animals will reuse their burrows. So they have an important role in our environment, but at times they get in the way of human interests or concerns over safety. So not that they're necessarily overly aggressive, but some people get a little bit more antsy when wildlife gets a little bit too close. They can undermine foundations because of their burrowing activities, particularly if you're dealing with like a slab situation and they burrow underneath that slab. The void could cause cracking within that concrete foundation, and so that could be an issue. Of course, that could be a significant economic issue as well. So of course we're not even mentioning the feeding on the garden per se, but here we're just focusing on denning woodchucks on your particular property. So let's talk about some legalities. Of course, your state may be different, but nevertheless, you need to find out what the laws are in your particular state. Some states classify woodchucks as a game animal, in which case there's a season. Many states will have exemptions for management for property owners who are suffering damage. You just need to be sure that you're following whatever the wildlife laws are for your particular location. If your state declares woodchucks as sort of unprotected wildlife, sort of like the equivalent of a rat, well, then there's basically an open season and you could probably kill them at will. But make sure, my point here is I'm not going to be your lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I want to make sure that you know that you need to contact. A lot of this information may be on your state wildlife agency's website. Check it out, put a call in, make sure that you're following the rules. The benefit, of course, is woodchucks aren't necessarily considered an endangered species, so it shouldn't be a big deal, but you want to be sure you're on the right side of the law. When you're dealing with woodchucks, their habitat that they live in, that is the locations, there could be poison ivy around, right? So, and also, of course, the black-legged tick, because you may be getting into some taller vegetation where they have their den. I don't know how much land you may have, right? So if sometimes if you have some property where one part of it's mowed and one part of it is kind of a wooded area, and they may be living in that wooded area where you're not mowing, well, understand when you're engaging in that, you could be exposing yourself to various ectoparasites like black-legged ticks and, of course, poison ivy. Make sure you know what poison ivy looks like. What is it? Leaves B3, let them be. And understand that poison ivy can be a little ground plant like this. It can also be a vine, and it can be a shrub. So don't just simply rely on the fact that, this is close to the ground, it can't be poison ivy, or this is tall from the ground, can't be poison ivy. And the leaves aren't necessarily always shiny, right? So a part of that depends on how much oil is still in them. They're more, you get poison ivy more in the earlier part of the season than in the last, and often it's typically the second person to touch the plant because you need to bruise the plant to allow the oil to emerge. And so just be careful. I had a bad case of poison ivy once. It was so bad I actually had the pustules between my fingers. I couldn't even close my fingers. It was so pustule. I had to take a pair of scissors and try to cut them off. It was bad. So just if you do get exposed, take soap and water and wash it off, and be sure to wash your clothes because it's the oil that gets onto your skin and causes that sort of a rash. All right, enough of that. Let's keep going. So let's take a look at the den of a woodchuck. Now, I've just sort of drawn something here for you. Your den may be different. Keep in mind that sometimes a new den may only have one entrance, right? So you have to let the animal teach you what they're doing. But you always need to keep in mind that there could be a second or a third entrance. Typically, you're not getting beyond 3, although it's always possible, right, in terms of how long that animal's been there and how much they're aggressively digging. But you always need to look for at least 2, but it's not a law that there's 2, but often there is 2, right? Sometimes there just isn't absolutes in nature, so you need to keep that in mind. So if you find one, I need to look for the other. So typically it's easier to find the main entrance, and that will often have the soil porch. And the soil porch is the excavation. It's where the woodchuck has thrown all the soil that he has dug out. Let me show you another picture of that. Here we have a main entrance. See that large soil plume in front of the hole? That's the main entrance. So that's where he started digging in, and he just kicks the soil behind him. However, the hidden entrance lacks that soil because he literally kind of digs from one end to the other. And so when he gets to the other end, there's no soil being kicked out because he pushes it out the main entrance in. So that one's clean and often is hidden because that's sort of his escape route. If he has a predator coming in from one end, he wants to be able to run out the back door and vice versa. So you need to be aware of that. And so typically those holes, let me go back to my earlier one. Typically, those 2 holes will be within 20 feet or so of each other. So kind of do some concentric circles walking around. Be careful because you may step in it and hurt yourself an ankle. So make sure you're keeping your wits about you. Don't be distracted while you're walking along. You could injure yourself as you're walking along because you may not see that plunge hole or the hidden entrance as it's also known. So woodchuck sign has already showed you this particular sign. Notice that we have the main entrance with the soil plume that's called a porch. And then, of course, the hidden entrance. And woodchuck burrows tend to be 6 to 8 inches wide. They can be larger, of course, depending on usage and the age and size of the woodchuck. You may see a trail, depending on how tall the vegetation is to that's where the woodchuck is moving in and out, and that may help you find some of these entrances. So what are some ways to get rid of a woodchuck has decided to occupy your particular area? What are some things that you can do to get rid of them without necessarily causing the animal to be dead, right? And you're not trapping it and dumping it somewhere else. That would be another presentation. We're just talking about how do we evict that woodchuck to have him move on to a different spot. Well, some of you may be thinking, well, are there frightening devices that could work? Now, frightening devices are non-chemical tools that try to use fear to convince an animal to move along. Unfortunately, the bottom line for woodchucks is none of these are going to work. However, you could have, if you have a dog, chances are that the woodchuck isn't going to take up residence in an area where the dog has easy access. But of course, there's always exceptions. But as a rule, think of it as a bank with a guard handy that's really paying attention is going to be less likely to be robbed than one that doesn't have one, right? So this is the kind of idea there with a dog. And of course, it also would depend on the aggression and size of the animal as well. But as a general rule, frightening devices are essentially a waste of time. If you're just dying to spend money, I guess have at it and fine, certainly you can email me to tell me how you think I'm wrong or something, nevertheless, but I'm just trying to save you some finances here. Their frightening devices are used for other animals, but and often they don't work for them either for very long, but you may get some initial success. But as a general rule, these are not going to work for you. Now, what I'm going to be suggesting for you is a concept known as hazing. Hazing is basically being a bad neighbor. And I have an illustration here of a mother who's raising her child, and of course the guy next door is doing a karaoke day and causing the child to wake up and that sort of thing, right? That's kind of what you're going to do for your woodchuck, is you're going to make it known to that woodchuck that living on the property in that den is not really a good idea. Now, here's the deal. Hazing works best when you do it soon, not after the woodchuck has been long established, because part of the challenge is if a woodchuck, let's say it's a female with young, she is going to be loath to try to find a new location. So there's a mythology in the United States that thinks that somehow there are tons of homes just waiting for animals to occupy. There's plenty of open space for them to move to. That's simply not true. So understand you're making a big ask trying to convince that animal to move on. Not only is it a lot of work and labor to build a new den, but it's also a lot of work and labor to find a location that's suitable for a new den, right? And they're not built on trees. Just like we've had our own housing problems here in the United States, think of what it is for an animal, right? It is hard to do this because you have also animals looking to eat you and harm you and this sort of thing. So keep that in mind. You want to do it sooner than later, but of course, as good Americans, we always make sure we wait as long as possible. And because, as one of my favorite quotes is, hard work may pay off in the end, but procrastination always pays now, right? So this is what we end up doing. And then once you have a situation where it's maybe a female with young, or maybe a woodchuck that's really well established in a particular area, he has food sources, they're loath to move on. And so it can be very hard to do the hazing at this point. So my bottom line here is do it early, be prepared to have to go the distance here, right? Because you were trying to convince this animal to leave their home to go build a new one. Now, how would you feel, to try to sort of anthropomorphize the situation, how would you feel if a neighbor came in and started blasting heavy metal music at 3 o'clock in the morning, trying to wake you up? Would you just simply leave because you have a new neighbor? And chances are you wouldn't, right? And you'd probably resist it to certain degrees. Well, the animal's going to do the same thing. So be prepared to go in a long haul. So you need to be persistent daily on this particular hazing practice. And you need to make sure this is not going to be, snap your fingers and it's all going to go away. That's not what's going to happen here. If you need something done quicker, then we have to go with other methods. Some of them are listed in my book in the Wildlife Removal Handbook. Okay, you can certainly check that out from my website. Now, one of the caveats when we're doing hazing that's non-lethal, right, the animal may move, but that doesn't mean he's going to move to an area that you're happy about. Sometimes the animal may move from one spot on your property to another spot on your property. Now, that may or may not be a good thing, depending on your situation, right? But you need to be prepared for the animal to move, right? I'm trying to make sure I give you all the bad news so that if something bad happens, you're like, okay, well, I was one of those things. There's no guarantee he's going to stay on the property and move to where you don't want him to go, but it's possible, right? So just keep that in the back of your mind and just understand when you move him once, it's probably going to be a little easier to move him again, nevertheless. All right, so what are the options for yourself? Well, the first one, of course, is simply backfilling. And that is getting up every day and backfilling all the burrows that you have there. Get a good shovel, and dig it back in. Now think about what it would be like if someone kept gluing the locks to your house, right? It'd get really irritating pretty quick, but it wouldn't happen overnight, right? You wouldn't just quit overnight, but it would start getting pretty old. Well, that's kind of what you're doing with the woodchuck. Now, they can dig through it, to be sure, but it gets to be, you're letting them know that there's something going on with this burrow, and you want them to get the sense that their burrow is not safe. That's the kind of idea that you're going for. Now, what I'm suggesting that you do is don't fill the hole with objects, right? It's a lot of people like, well, I'm going to throw rocks in there and do this or that. I'm not suggesting that because I think there's you don't want to make it so hard for the animal that he's trapped there, right? And then something really bad may happen in terms of where he's digging his way out. And there may be an element of cruelty there, right? So I think you want to make sure you're careful with that. So I'm not recommending you fill it with objects. What I'm just saying is you backfill it with loose soil, all the holes that are connected to this particular den, right? And then just be consistent in doing that. So if you're a homebody and you do it in the morning or do it in the evening and then you see it opened up the next morning, you backfill it. And then if you're able to check it maybe in the afternoon, you can maybe be able to backfill it again. You just want to be persistent in doing that. And you may have to do that for a few weeks, right? So make sure you're into this for the long haul, all right? So option 2 takes it up a notch a little bit, and now you're looking at flooding. Because again, when you're a burrowing animal, you don't want to have water. You want to have a dry den. You don't want to have water coming in. Now, obviously, there's some water with rain, but here you're bringing that hose into the burrow. So you get yourself a garden hose, throw it up, put it down into the burrow, and then turn it on for like 5 minutes, right? Full blast. Now, before you do that, I would encourage you not to do it on burrows that are up against foundations, right? So I did one job where there was a hole the hole was against the foundation of the house. We flooded, and what would you know? Some of that water found its way into the basement. I am not recommending that for you. So you need to keep that in mind as a possibility. So ideally, flooding should be done for burrows that are not connected to a basement foundation, right? So now if you're dealing with a slab, that changes the dynamic a little bit, but you need to probably take some caution here. I'm not an engineer, and so you may need to be thinking about, is that good for the foundation to have water going underneath there? So you may need to talk to someone who has some qualifications, because if you're dealing with a slab, you want to make sure that once that woodchuck is gone, you are filling in that hole as much as possible to try to prevent that slab from cracking, right? So that may require you to put some soil in, take a pole, kind of ram it down in there, because you know how it always bunches up at the top, and then you want to just keep backfilling. Of course, it's going to settle, so you're going to need to backfill that some more. So you may need to talk to someone about how to refill that hole if you're dealing with a slab, because you don't want your foundation there, your slab, to crack. When you're inserting it down the burrow, wear gloves, of course, and you want to just put it down as deep as, 4 feet or so. If you can't, well, then you can't, right? Do what you can. I don't think it's necessary to go any farther than that. Turn on the water full blast. I'm referring here to a 1-inch garden hose, something that's typical, right? And then you're going to turn that on and time it for 5 minutes. That's going to be a fair amount of water. And then do that for each opening and then pull everything away and then backfill the holes. Monitor for a few days. Remember, you got to give the animal a little time to get out, right? You've just sort of disrupted their home. And if they're still hanging around after, 4 or 5 days, then you may need to take it in again and redo it. And I would suggest adding another minute to that process. So then you'd be doing it for 6 minutes, right? So now, could you go longer if you wished? Absolutely, you could, but understand that woodchuck may come out of the burrow, and you need to be sort of prepared for that. I'm not asking you to linger near the hole because you don't want to run the risk, albeit small, of the woodchuck necessarily charging you. So there's things that we would do as professionals that I'm not recommending because I know that people who are non-professionals are going to be watching this, right? And sometimes people cut corners in the wrong place and they're not always ready for things that they're not anticipating, right? So we have to be careful with that. So I don't want you to linger near the burrow. Backfill it when your flooding is done. Pull the hose out. Monitor for a few days. If the woodchuck has moved on, add a minute. And of course, you may need to do that a few times, right? And so maybe by the third week, you're at 7 minutes of flooding, right? That's starting to get to be a fair amount of water if you're doing things full blast, right, with your hose. So eventually that woodchuck is going to move along. But again, he may be more resistant if it's a female with young, so that may be a problem for you as well. If you're like, boy, Stephen, you're having all these caveats. Yeah, this is what wildlife control is all about because animals have a mind of their own, right? It's not like bugs where bug behavior is pretty, kind of is what it is. But when you're dealing with animals that have higher order thinking, they can be different in that regard. Not to say that all insects are marching, according to certain disciplines to say, but there's a lot. They're going to be, their behavior is going to be, in my opinion, a lot more predictable in that regard, right? But animals are different, just like think of your dog, right? Some dogs are highly obedient, listening to you straight away. Other dogs are not, right? What's the reason for that? It's the same species, right? Different animals have different behaviors. Okay, so keep that in mind. Option 3 deals with repellents. Now, repellents are chemicals, actually pesticides, that are used to cause the animal to move on. Now, the problem here is because they're pesticides, they're regulated by the EPA. So when you're just saying, well, I'm just going to get some coyote urine, you've got to make sure that the coyote urine is registered in your particular state. Now, is it likely that if you bought some coyote urine and you're using it as a repellent, sprinkling it around the area of the den, that the animal, you're going to be heavily prosecuted for that? Probably not, right? But I'm not recommending it, right? Because it's this sort of grayish area about the law, right? And so because the way the EPA defines a repellent is any chemical used to manage a pest. And that's what a coyote urine would be. Now you say, well, people use coyote urine in trapping, right? But they're using it as a lure, not as a repellent. So you can see you can have the same chemical, but how it's being used determines whether it's a pesticide or whether it's a lure. Yeah, it's a legal distinction here, right? And so I'll let you decide whether you agree with that or not. But nevertheless, some of the research you're seeing here in the screen is for trying to prevent woodchuck feeding. But nevertheless, woodchucks are going to be more afraid of a predator like a coyote or a bobcat than they would be for something else. And so it looks like there's some other repellents that people have tried to try to protect plantings. Do not use those. Fox are not going to be really big enough to really be a threat to many woodchucks, to be sure. So don't use fox urine. If you're going to use urine, think coyote urine, think bobcat urine. And you're just going to sprinkle some of that around the burrow area. If you wanted to backfill it, I guess you could backfill it well and sprinkle it around, and then see if that woodchuck realizes that it's a bad place to live and if they move on. If you don't want to backfill the hole, you can always take some sticks and put some sticks over the hole, just embed them in the soil a little bit so the wind doesn't blow them away. Because if the woodchuck is still there, kind of make a little X design or something. Just as long as the gaps between the sticks are no more than 3 inches, the woodchuck will just simply push through them, and that could be a trigger to let you know whether he's still there or not. And if you do that for a few days and there's no activity, chances are the woodchuck has moved on. I recommend waiting at least 3 days with no activity during good weather, right? So if the weather's been like hell for 3 or 4 days, maybe just nonstop rain, you need to wait at least 3 days of good weather to ensure that the animal is not just denned up, but that likely is gone. Okay. So when you're using repellents, keep in mind, repellents are pesticides. Read the label before you purchase. Make sure it's registered. There are urines out there that are registered under the EPA. Different states have different rules. Some states, a little bit more requirements, like the state of Montana, for example, requires all repellents to be registered. Other states may differ in that regard, but you need to be sure you're following that pesticide because it is a pesticide. And you need to keep that in mind. You don't really have to worry so much about the endangered species bulletin per se with this because it's nothing. These things are not toxic in the sense that they're not being used as a poison to kill the woodchuck. But if you want to check it out, you can certainly look at Bulletins Live too to see if there are any restrictions on pesticides in your particular area. And then always remember, understand you're using urine. Make sure you're protecting yourself. Make sure you're washing your hands. Urine is urine, and there could be bacteria or materials that you could be infected on if you have cuts in your hands, for example. So wear gloves. Wear protective gloves. Read the label first. Wear protective gloves, even if the label doesn't require them. And then be careful how you're using it, and then make sure you wash your hands thoroughly. When you're finished with that, you may even want to change your clothes, but think about wind direction before you start spraying, right? You don't want to be spraying urine and have the wind blow it right into your body. That's just not a good way to go, right? So think about some of those things before you're using, and make sure you're persistent and monitor. And your woodchuck will move along in a non-lethal way. So, I hope you found that helpful for dealing with denning woodchucks on your property. If you have questions, comments, yes, even criticisms, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you're looking to be a guest on our show, we'd love to hear from you. Do check out our instructions for guests available on the whether YouTube or Rumble, depending on what format you're looking at us on. Just look up thoughts for guests, and that should be able to come up in my particular feed. It'll give you some background on what we're looking for, because people often have questions. We always are interested in having guests on our show because we think there's a lot of information out there and services and products that could get a wider hearing, and we would love to help you in that particular regard. All right, well, that's it for this week. Until next time, take care, everybody.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.